Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
This is Lindsay Smith-Rogers. Today, Stephanie Desmon talks avian flu with virologist Pekosz and veterinarian Meghan Davis. The H5N1 virus, for the first time, has been identified in dairy cows and their milk across several states and has sickened a human. Our guests discuss the emerging disease and how concerned you should be, whether you're a farmer or a city dweller. Let's listen.
Meghan Davis and Pekosz, thanks so much for joining me.
Always a pleasure.
To be here. So today I want to talk about the latest in bird flu news. There's been a development in recent days and weeks. Andy, could you start with giving us the overview?
Yeah, so, for the past 2 years in particular, there have been a lot of cases of infection of wild migratory birds with an avian virus that we'll call H5N1. This virus has been around for over 20 years. It's been mutating over time, and something happened in the last couple of years to really cause an explosion of cases in wild birds. And not surprisingly, that's led to spillover into infections in some poultry farms. There's been an increase in mammals that have been infected, such as skunks and bears and foxes, presumably from feeding on dead infected birds. And sort of recently, we've now seen spillover of this virus into dairy cows, first reported in Texas, now reported in a couple of other states. It looks like it is exactly the same virus so far that has been infecting the bird populations. But anytime the virus gets into a new host, and cattle have not been reported to be infected with any of the influenza A viruses, human or animal, to date. So anytime this virus enters a new host, we sort of set off some alarm bells in the scientific community to see what's going on there.
And there has been a human case as well.
And most recently, there's been one human case. I expect that over the next few days or weeks, we're going to be seeing more cases in cows, probably more cases in humans, because humans are close contact with cows during many of this dairy processes. So hopefully this will not be a large outbreak, but we certainly expect to see more cases coming through.
So Meghan, something tells me you're going to tell me you're not surprised by what's going on.
Well, I am surprised that it's in dairy cows because, as Andy said, was not something that was really high up on our radar. When we think about animal models for influenza, we think about mustelids, like ferrets that people might keep as pets, or mink. We've talked about the mink outbreaks, not only with influenza, but also with SARS-CoV-2. So they clearly do infectious respiratory viruses pretty well. And also cats. And we have seen that there have been a number of sick cats on farms that tested positive that may have presumptive or potentially confirmed positives. This is an emerging situation. So I think one of the most interesting things that I'm seeing is that there is some active sampling of different kinds of animals that might be on these farms to see where you might have positives. What is, I think, most interesting about seeing it in dairy is that we, have largely focused on other kinds of challenges with dairy and haven't really been thinking about biosecurity and biocontainment for things like avian influenza that's transmitted typically from a bird reservoir. And so dairy farms are much different than a typical poultry operation or a typical swine operation. They're often quite open to the air. And so when I was in dairy practice as a veterinarian, I can tell you, I saw lots of interaction between birds and cows. And in fact, the birds might, spend time in areas where the cows might eat. And so that is a huge issue. I think one of the other things we're paying attention to in this is that we are seeing some disease in the cows. I've not heard of high mortality yet, which is really somewhat reassuring for me, who loves cows. but they have been showing what we consider to be fairly non-specific signs. What we might call, in veterinary parlance, ain't doing right. So ADR, they are not eating well, they're not milking well for the cows in milk. And most of these tend to be somewhat older cows, which is interesting because adult cows who are in milk, are lactating, are maybe in a different category of susceptibility than your young calves. So what we don't know yet is if perhaps the virus is in all the populations within the farm and only some of them are showing symptoms. So there are a lot of questions that we need to answer from a veterinary perspective as we continue in this outbreak.
So what about the milk? What about the milk they produce? Is that safe for consumption?
So the answer to that is interesting. And I will say for the vast majority of people listening to this podcast, if you buy pasteurized milk from a commercial dairy processor, the risk is extremely low. We recognize that pasteurization, which involves temperature and pressure and time, is designed to inactivate microbes to make the milk safer to consume and to give it longer shelf life. Now, if you're someone who prefers raw milk products, whether that's liquid milk that you drink or raw milk cheese, I would advise against consuming those products, no matter where you live in the United States or elsewhere at this time, in part because there are other risks, not just avian influenza, and it hasn't been recommended to drink these products. Now, if you are someone who has your own single cow on your own farm and you're drinking your cow's milk, that's between you and the cow, right? But I think that for people who are buying it commercially, I strongly advise against it. And so what we think about in terms of who is at risk and where do we need to spend our efforts from a surveillance perspective, like who needs to be on high alert right now, who needs to be thinking about these things, are our state authorities and our veterinarians who are looking at people who have a lot of contact, either with the cows or with their products. So people who haul the milk, who are processing the milk at a processing plant, all of those workers, I think, on our radar in terms of risk. And they're the ones who want to recommend use of personal protective equipment, maybe some additional administrative controls, like how they work, changing up what they do. But for the average person, particularly living, in a city or suburb, buying commercial milk, I think at this point, we don't have any evidence that would suggest a concern.
So, Andy, as we get more data back from the surveillance of the cows and we find more sick cows, what are we looking to learn from that information?
Well, two things are really important. One is what sort of Meghan just said and what you brought up about the virus in the milk. That's a really unique thing that most scientists probably weren't expecting to see, because what it means is that the virus has gone from the respiratory tract, the nose and the lungs of the cow, and has made it all the way to the milk through lots of different organs, through the blood, through infecting other cells. And that's something we don't see with human influenza virus in humans. In humans, it stays within the respiratory tract. We have seen H5N1 move out of the respiratory tract in other animals, but usually that's associated with a really fast mortality. So the animals, as soon as the virus leaves the lungs, the animals are so sick that they die. As Meghan mentioned, we're seeing a case here where the animals don't seem to be really sick, but the virus is making it to some other parts of the animal. And that's going to be really important for us to understand, because that's going to tell us something perhaps unique about the H5N1 virus compared to the seasonal human viruses that we're thinking about. I think the other really critical thing here is if there is spread of this virus from cow to cow, the question really jumps forward, is the virus changing and getting better adapted to replicating or spreading in cows? Why is that important to humans? Well, again, bird flu jumping from a bird to a mammal is important because mammals have caused problems when it comes to bird flu viruses replicating. Anything that allows that virus to adapt to a mammal has the potential for making it better to infect humans, because while cows and humans are very different, we are both mammals and share a lot of things that these viruses have to overcome to infect mammals. So understanding what happens now with the spread of the virus and how the sequence of the virus changes is going to be critically important. The first sequences look like the virus is almost identical to the bird virus, but we haven't really sampled animals that presumably acquired the infection from other cows. And so continued sequencing and understanding, is the virus changing, is the second really important thing.
So I'm wondering also, so if it's spreading from cow to cow, that makes it's a whole different problem, right?
Yes, it means that your mitigation strategies, so what those of us who might want to try to prevent spread would have to do in order to preserve the farms that don't have it from being exposed. And one of the things, and I'll say as a former dairy vet, I wrote a lot of health certificates because there is a lot of swapping of cows in the dairy industry. Now, some farms may be closed, right? Individual farms may say, I'm not interested in bringing in new cows. I'm going to raise all my own replacements on farm. And they may have extremely good security measures when it comes to quarantine if they do decide to bring an animal in. And there are others. This is a diverse population of farmers. Each of them has their own way of doing things. And that means that we may need to go out and educate farmers about perhaps restricting certain sale or trade of dairy cows if we have evidence that might show that you could introduce avian flu through a cow brought in on a farm. So I think that's a really important piece, and something I'm very interested to see develop is, where were each of these cows exposed? To what degree was this maybe one event that is now spreading through these networks of sale and trade and movement of dairy cows? Or is this multiple events where you've had introduction from birds? Because I think that also changes the dynamics as we think about the genetics and the potential for evolution. So stay tuned. I think there's a lot more epidemiology to be done on both the veterinary and human side there.
And Andy, we're seeing, as you said earlier, we're seeing much more H5N1 in the recent last couple of years. I guess even though at the moment it's not a threat to people, I guess the concern as we evolve is that if this disease mutates, what are we concerned about?
Yeah. So this H5N1 registers as what we call a virus with pandemic potential. What does that mean? Well, humans have seen human influenza, and that H5 that I keep saying when I refer to this avian virus, humans have influenzas that are H1s and H3s. What does that really mean for us? Well, it means that all of us presumably have some immunity to H1 and H3 influenza viruses. They can cause seasonal epidemics, but they can't cause these pandemics at the level of like what we saw with COVID, because there's just too much immunity in the population that limits the spread and that dampens down disease severity. This H5, the human population is essentially completely naive to H5 viruses. So all of us are susceptible. And therefore, similar to what we saw with COVID, in the worst case scenario, if this virus enters humans and starts to spread among humans, all of us are susceptible, and we could see massive increases in terms of numbers of cases. The real wild card is H5 viruses are rather deadly in in poultry. They're not so deadly in wild birds. They seem to be deadly in mammals, but we don't know what they'll do in humans. So it really is the idea that this H5N1 represents a potential pandemic threat, because there really is no pre-existing immunity in the human population against it, outside of perhaps a few laboratories where people have gotten some experimental vaccines. My kids are two of them that actually were involved in some H5 vaccine studies early on in their lives. But for the most part, the population is completely vulnerable to H5 viruses.
Meghan, I'm going to let you close it out.
Well, thanks. I think that, again, coming back to who needs to panic when, right now, people like Andy and I are in full panic mode, right? Full response. And the average person should just be aware and stay tuned and avoid things like raw milk products. However, because we are seeing the potential for disease in cats, we don't know yet if that came from the cows from birds or from some other pathway. It's always a good idea to prevent your cats from having contact with wild birds. So if they're indoors, keep them indoors. And if they become ill, consult your veterinarian.
Andy Pekosz, Meghan Davis, thanks so much for joining me.
Such a pleasure. Thank you.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, Stephanie Desmon, and Grace Ceciri. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Holly Cardinale, Spencer Greer, Matthew Martin, and Philip Porter, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production support from Catherine Ricardo. Social media run by Grace Ceciri and Eliza Rosen. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.